Margaret Chen woke up at 6 in the morning like she did every day. She made coffee for her husband James and checked her phone for messages from her children. Emma was 17 and always busy with school activities. David was 15 and played basketball for his high school team. Both kids were still sleeping when Margaret started making breakfast. James came down wearing his blue suit and tie. He was a surgeon at the city hospital and always looked serious in the morning. Margaret handed him his coffee and toast. He ate quickly while reading medical journals on his tablet. They had been married for 20 years but rarely talked much. In the mornings anymore. "I have surgery at 8, James said without looking up. "Will you pick up my dry cleaning today?" Margaret nodded. She always picked up his dry cleaning on Tuesdays. She also did the grocery shopping, cleaned the house, and handled all the things that kept their family running smoothly. James made good money as a doctor, but Margaret handled everything else. After James left for work, Margaret woke up the kids and made sure they had everything for school. Emma needed her volleyball uniform washed. David forgot his history project at home yesterday and was worried about his grade. Margaret helped them both and drove them to school in her small blue car. The house felt quiet after everyone left. Margaret looked around at the empty rooms. She had cleaned everything yesterday but found small things to organize anyway. The kitchen counters were already spotless. The living room furniture was perfectly arranged. She watered the plants by the window and thought about what to do with the rest of her day. Margaret remembered when she was younger and had dreams of doing something special with her life. She had wanted to be a teacher or maybe work in a library. But after she married James and had children, those dreams seemed less important. Taking care of her family became her full-time job. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. There was an email from the community center about volunteer opportunities. Margaret already helped at the library twice a week, reading to children and organizing books. She enjoyed it because it made her feel useful. At 10 in the morning, Margaret drove to the grocery store. She bought the same things she always bought: milk, bread, chicken for dinner, and vegetables. She ran into Mrs. Johnson from down the street, who talked for 15 minutes about her grandson's soccer team. Margaret listened politely and smiled at the right times. While standing in the checkout line, Margaret saw a newspaper with an advertisement that caught her attention. The Whitmore Conservatory was offering music lessons for adults. The ad showed a picture of a beautiful piano and mentioned that no experience was necessary. Margaret stared at the ad and remembered something from long ago. When Margaret was 8 years old, her grandmother had an old piano in her small apartment. Margaret's grandmother had come from Poland many years ago and sometimes played sad, beautiful songs. Margaret would sit next to her grandmother and try to copy the finger movements. Her grandmother would smile and show her how to press the keys. Gently, "Music is like talking," her grandmother had said in her soft accent. But instead of words, you use sounds to tell people how you feel. Margaret had taken piano lessons for 2 years when she was young. Her parents worked in a factory and could not afford many things, but they saved money for her lessons. Margaret loved going to Mrs. Patterson's house every Thursday after school. She learned to play simple songs and dreamed of playing more difficult pieces someday. But when Margaret turned 11, her father lost his job. The piano lessons stopped. The family had to move to a smaller apartment. Margaret's grandmother got sick and could not play piano anymore. All the music slowly disappeared from Margaret's life. Margaret paid for her groceries and drove home. She could not stop thinking about the piano advertisement. She put the groceries away and found herself standing in the living room where James kept his expensive sound system. He sometimes played classical music when he read medical books, but Margaret never touched the equipment. She went to her bedroom and opened the closet. In the back, behind her winter clothes, was a small box she had not opened in years. Inside was sheet music from her childhood piano lessons. The papers were yellow and the edges were soft from age. Margaret found a piece called Fur Elise that she had learned when she was 10 years old. Margaret sat on her bed and tried to remember how the song sounded. She moved her fingers like she was playing piano keys. Some of the melody came back to her. She hummed quietly and felt something warm in her chest that she had not felt in many years. At lunchtime, Margaret made herself a sandwich and continued thinking about the music lessons. She looked up the Whitmore Conservatory website on her laptop. It was a famous school where serious musicians studied. The building looked impressive with tall windows and stone walls. Margaret felt nervous just looking at the pictures. The adult education program was new. It said that people of all ages and skill levels were welcome. The classes met twice a week, in the afternoon. Margaret calculated that she could attend after her volunteer work at the library and still be home before the kids finished school. Margaret picked up Emma and David from school at 3:30. They talked about their day while she drove them home. Emma had made the varsity volleyball team and was excited about the games next month. David had gotten a B on his history test and wanted to celebrate by going to the movies with friends. On Saturday, when James came home from work, the family ate dinner together. Margaret had made chicken with rice and vegetables. James talked about his patients and the new equipment at the hospital. The kids shared stories about their teachers and friends. Margaret listened and asked questions but did not mention the piano lessons. After dinner, Margaret cleaned the kitchen while James watched television news. Emma did homework in her room and David practiced basketball shots in the backyard. Margaret finished the dishes and sat at the kitchen table again. She opened her laptop and looked at the conservatory website once more. The registration form was simple. Name, age, phone number, and previous musical experience. Margaret started to fill it out but stopped. What if she was not good enough? What if the other students were much younger and more talented? What if James thought it was a waste of time and money? Margaret closed the laptop and went to bed. But she could not sleep. She kept thinking about her grandmother's hands on the piano keys and the way music had made her feel safe and happy when she was young. She wondered if it was too late to try again. The next morning, Margaret made breakfast and got everyone ready for their day. After James and the kids left, she opened her laptop one more time. Before she could change her mind, she filled out the registration form and clicked send. Her heart was beating fast as she waited for the confirmation email. Margaret Chun had just signed up for piano lessons at the Whitmore Conservatory. She had no idea that this simple decision would change her life forever. Margaret received the confirmation email 3 days later. The message was short and formal. It told her to come to the Whitmore Conservatory on Monday at 2 in the afternoon. She would meet with Professor Elena Volkov for her first lesson. Margaret felt excited and nervous at the same time. On Monday morning, Margaret dressed carefully. She wore her best black pants and a white blouse. She wanted to look nice but not too fancy. James had already left for work, and the kids were at school. Margaret ate a small breakfast because her stomach felt tight with nerves. The conservatory building was even more impressive in person. Margaret parked her car and walked slowly toward the entrance. The building was made of gray stone with tall windows. She could hear piano music coming from inside. The sounds were complex and beautiful. Margaret felt small as she pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the floors were made of polished marble. The walls were decorated with paintings of famous musicians. Margaret saw young people walking through the halls carrying instrument cases. They all looked confident and serious. Margaret felt like she did not belong in such an elegant place. A woman at the front desk gave Margaret directions to Professor Volkov's studio. Margaret climbed the stairs to the second floor. The halls were lined with practice rooms where students played different instruments. She heard violins, cellos, and several pianos. The music was more advanced than anything Margaret had ever heard in person. Professor Volkov's studio was at the end of the hall. Margaret knocked softly on the door. A voice with a strong accent told her to come in. The room was large with a beautiful black piano in the center. There were bookshelves filled with sheet music and photographs of famous pianists on the walls. Professor Elena Volkov was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back tightly. She wore a black dress and expensive jewelry. Her eyes were sharp and she looked at Margaret with the expression of someone examining something unpleasant. She did not smile or offer to shake hands. "You are the adult student from the outreach program," Professor Volkov said. It was not a question. Her voice was cold and formal. I assume you have some musical background. Margaret felt her face get warm. I took lessons when I was young. But that was a long time ago. Professor Volkov looked at Margaret's simple clothes. An old purse. She made a small sound that might have been disapproval. Sit at the piano. Play something so I can evaluate your level. Margaret walked to the piano bench. Her hands were shaking slightly. The piano was much fancier than any instrument she had ever played. The keys were perfectly white and black. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys and tried to remember Für Elise. She began to play the melody. Slowly, her fingers felt stiff and uncertain. She made several mistakes and had to stop twice to remember the next notes. When she finished, the room was quiet. Professor Volkov wrote something in a notebook. That was adequate for a beginner, Professor Volkov said. But this is a conservatory, not a community center. We have standards here. Just then, another professor entered the room. He was a short man with a beard wearing a dark suit. Professor Volkov introduced him as Professor Harrison Mills, who taught advanced piano students. This is Mrs. Chun from the outreach program, Professor Volkov said to Professor Mills. She said the words outreach program like they tasted bad in her mouth. Professor Mills listened while Margaret played Für Elise again. When she finished, he and Professor Volkov exchanged a look. They stepped away from the piano and spoke quietly to each other. Margaret could hear some of their words. This is what we get when we lower our standards, Professor Mills said. The administration thinks this will bring good publicity, Professor Volkov replied. But it makes our program look like a joke. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She wanted to leave but did not know how to do it politely. She sat at the piano bench and stared at her hands. Professor Volkov came back to the piano with a thick book of sheet music. She opened it to a page that was covered with complex notes. The music looked extremely difficult with many sharps and flats. Margaret had never seen anything so complicated. This is Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Professor Volkov announced. You will learn this piece. Margaret looked at the sheet music and felt panic. I don't think I can play something this hard. Maybe we could start with something simpler? Professor Mills laughed. It was not a kind laugh. Mrs. Chun, this is a conservatory. We don't teach Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star here. If you want simple music, perhaps you should find a different school. But this looks very advanced, Margaret said quietly. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like this. Professor Volkov's expression grew colder. Are you questioning my judgment? I have been teaching piano for 30 years. I know what my students can accomplish. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes, but tried to hide them. I just think maybe we could work up to something this difficult. The monthly student showcase is in 6 weeks, Professor Volkov said. You will perform this piece at that recital. All the faculty will be there, along with students and members of the community. It will be an excellent opportunity for you to demonstrate what the outreach program can achieve. Professor Mills smiled in a way that made Margaret feel uncomfortable. Yes, I think this will be very educational for everyone involved. Margaret looked at the sheet music again. The notes seemed to dance on the page. She had never seen anything so complicated. What if I can't learn it in time? Then you will have learned an important lesson about your limitations, Professor Volkov replied. Music is not for everyone. Mrs. Chun, some people are meant to be listeners, not performers. Margaret felt like she had been slapped. She gathered her purse and the sheet music. I'll try my best. See that you do, Professor Volkov said. Your lesson time is Mondays and Thursdays at 2 o'clock. Do not be late. Margaret left the conservatory feeling smaller than when she had arrived. She sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine. The sheet music lay on the passenger seat like a challenge she could not meet. During the drive home, Margaret thought about Professor Volkov's cold eyes and Professor Mills' cruel smile. They had made it clear that they expected her to fail. The performance in 6 weeks was not an opportunity. It was a trap designed to embarrass her and prove that ordinary people like her did not belong in their world. Margaret arrived home just as Emma and David were getting off the school bus. They asked about her piano lesson, and she told them it went fine. She did not mention the difficult piece or the professor's attitude. She made dinner and helped with homework like she always did. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the chop and sheet music spread in front of her. The notes looked like a foreign language. She had 6 weeks to learn something that seemed impossible. Professor Volkov and Professor Mills were waiting for her to fail. Margaret closed the sheet music and went to bed. She did not know if she was brave enough to continue with the lessons. But she also did not know if she was ready to give up on music again. Margaret woke up at 5 in the morning on Tuesday. She could not sleep because she kept thinking about the Chopin music. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the sheet music spread out in front of her. The notes still looked impossible, but she decided to try anyway. Margaret had an old upright piano in the basement that James had bought years ago when Emma wanted to take lessons. Emma had lost interest after 6 months, and the piano had been silent ever since. Margaret went downstairs and lifted the heavy wooden cover. The keys were dusty, and some of them stuck when she pressed them. She placed the Chopin sheet music on the piano stand and tried to play the first few notes. Her fingers felt clumsy and the sounds were harsh. Margaret had forgotten how hard it was to make the piano sound beautiful. She practiced the opening measures over and over until her fingers remembered the movements. When James came down for breakfast, he found Margaret at the kitchen table with red eyes and tired hands. "You look exhausted," he said while checking his phone. "Did you sleep at all?" "I was practicing piano," Margaret said. "I have a difficult piece to learn." James poured coffee without looking at her. "Don't let this hobby take over your life. You still have responsibilities to this family." Margaret felt hurt but did not say anything. She made breakfast for everyone and got the kids ready for school. After they left, she went back to the basement piano and continued practicing. Her fingers were already sore, but she kept trying. By Thursday, Margaret had learned the first page of the Chopin piece. It was slow progress, and she made many mistakes. She went to her lesson feeling nervous about what Professor Volkov would say. The professor listened to Margaret play and shook her head. "This is not acceptable," Professor Volkov said. "You are playing like a child. Where is the emotion? Where is the understanding of what Chopin was trying to express?" Margaret felt her face turn red. "I'm still learning the notes. I thought I should get those right first." "Music is not just about pressing the correct keys," Professor Volkov replied coldly. "Any machine can do that. Music is about communicating feelings and ideas. You are not communicating anything except your own limitations." Margaret left the lesson feeling worse than before. She drove home with tears in her eyes. That evening, she sat at the basement piano and cried. The music seemed too hard and the professors too mean. She thought about quitting the lessons and forgetting about piano forever. Emma found her mother in the basement at 10 o'clock that night. Margaret was still trying to play the same difficult section. Emma sat on the stairs and listened. "Mom, this sounds really hard. Are you sure you want to do this?" "I don't know if I can," Margaret admitted. "The professors think I'm wasting their time." "But you sound better than you did yesterday," Emma said. "I heard you practicing this morning before school." Margaret looked at her daughter with surprise. "You were listening?" "Mom, the whole house can hear you practicing. David and I think it's cool that you're trying something new." That night, Margaret lay in bed thinking about what Emma had said. Maybe she was getting better, even if it was slow. Maybe the professors were wrong about her. She decided to keep trying for another week. Margaret began waking up at 5 every morning to practice before the family got up. She practiced during lunch while everyone was at work and school. After dinner, she went back to the basement piano. Her fingers started to get stronger and the movements became more natural. On Saturday, Margaret was practicing when she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. She expected to see Emma or David, but instead she found James standing there with a strange expression on his face. "I didn't know you were this serious about piano," James said. "You've been practicing for hours." "Every day. I have a performance in 4 weeks," Margaret explained. "I need to be ready." James listened while Margaret played part of the Chopin piece. It was still not perfect, but it was much better than the week before. This sounds very complicated, he said. Are you sure you can learn it in time? I have to try, Margaret said. I can't quit now, James nodded slowly. I didn't realize this was so important to you. Maybe I should help you find a better piano the next Monday. Margaret arrived at her lesson feeling more confident. She had practiced the first 2 pages of the piece and could play them without stopping. Professor Volkov listened without expression. When Margaret finished, the professor was quiet for a long moment. You have improved, Professor Volkov said. Finally, but improvement is not enough. You need to understand what this music means. Chopin wrote this when he was homesick and heartbroken. He was thinking about Poland and the people he loved. What are you thinking about when you play? Margaret had never considered this question. I'm thinking about getting the notes right. That is your problem, Professor Volkov replied. You are playing technique, not music. Until you find something personal to express, you will never play this piece correctly that night, Margaret sat at the piano and thought about Professor Volkov's words. She tried to remember what her grandmother had told her about music being like talking with sounds instead of words. What did Margaret want to say? She began to play the opening of the Chopin piece again. This time, instead of thinking about the notes, she thought about her grandmother's hands on the piano keys. She thought about the dreams she had given up. When she got married, she thought about feeling invisible in her own family. Something changed in the music. The notes were the same, but they sounded different, more sad and beautiful. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, but she kept playing. For the first time, she was not just pressing keys. She was telling her story through the music. Emma appeared at the top of the basement stairs. Mom, that was beautiful. It sounded different from before. Margaret wiped her eyes and smiled. I think I'm starting to understand what the music is. What is it about? Emma asked. It's about wanting something more than what you have, Margaret said. It's about dreams that you thought were gone, but maybe they're not. Emma sat down next to her mother on the piano bench. I never knew you had dreams like that. I forgot about them for a long time, Margaret admitted. But maybe it's not too late to remember. From that night forward, Margaret practiced with new purpose. She was no longer just trying to avoid embarrassment. At the performance, she was trying to find her own voice through Chopin's music. The notes began to flow more naturally and the difficult sections became easier. 3 weeks before the performance, Margaret could play the entire piece from beginning to end. It was not perfect and she still made mistakes, but something magical was happening. The music was becoming part of her and she was becoming part of the music. Margaret had discovered that learning piano was not just about moving her fingers correctly. It was about finding pieces of herself that she had forgotten existed. Margaret had been practicing for 3 weeks when everything fell apart. She was in one of the small practice rooms at the conservatory, trying to master the most difficult section of the Chopin piece. Her fingers kept stumbling over the same rapid passage. No matter how many times she tried, she could not play it smoothly. The notes were supposed to flow like water, but they sounded choppy and forced. Margaret had watched videos of famous pianists playing this section and their hands moved so easily. Her hands felt clumsy and old. She had been practicing for 4 hours and her back ached from sitting at the piano bench. Margaret tried the difficult passage one more time. Her fingers tangled up in the middle and she hit several wrong notes. The sound was harsh and ugly. She put her head in her hands and started to cry. The performance was only 3 weeks away and she was not ready. I can't do this, Margaret whispered to herself. I'm not good enough. She had been fooling herself to think she could learn such a hard piece. Professor Volkov was right. Margaret was just an ordinary housewife who had no business trying to play music at a conservatory. She would embarrass herself at the performance and prove that the outreach program was a mistake. Margaret cried quietly in the practice room. She thought about calling James and asking him to come pick her up. She could quit the lessons and go back to her normal life. No one would blame her for giving up. The piece was too hard for someone with her limited skills. There was a soft knock on the practice room door. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and called out that she was busy. The door opened anyway, and an elderly man stepped inside. He was tall and thin, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire glasses. He wore a cardigan sweater and carried a cup of tea. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said gently. "I'm Professor Wright. I heard you crying and wondered if you needed help." Margaret felt embarrassed. "I'm fine. I was just having trouble with a difficult section." Professor Wright smiled. "May I listen?" Sometimes a fresh pair of ears can help. Margaret hesitated. She had never met Professor Wright before, but his voice was warm and encouraging. She nodded and placed her hands on the keys. She played the difficult passage and made the same mistakes as before. The notes crashed together in an ugly mess. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "I know it sounds terrible." Professor Wright sat down in the chair next to the piano. "You're trying to play it like a young person with perfect technique. But you're not a young person, are you?" Margaret shook her head. "I'm 42. I only started playing again a month ago." "Good," Professor Wright said. "That means you have something more valuable than technique. You have life experience." Margaret looked at him with confusion. "I don't understand." Professor Wright sipped his tea. "Tell me about your life, Mrs. Chun. What has made you sad? What has made you happy? What do you dream about when you're alone?" Margaret was surprised by the personal questions. "I don't know. Why that matters for piano playing. Chopin wrote this piece when he was heartbroken," Professor Wright explained. "He was far from home and missing the people he loved. He was thinking about opportunities he had lost and wondering if he would ever be truly happy again. Do you know those feelings?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I do. Then you understand this music better than most of my students," Professor Wright said. "They can play the notes perfectly, but they don't know what the music means." "You know what it means because you've lived it." Margaret felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they were different. "I gave up music when I was young. I always wondered what would have happened if I had kept playing, and now you're playing." "Again," Professor Wright said. "That's what this piece is about?" "It's about dreams that seem lost but then come back to life." Professor Wright asked Margaret to play the difficult passage again. This time, instead of thinking about the technique, she thought about her grandmother's piano. She thought about the years when music had been missing from her life. She thought about sitting in the practice room and feeling like she belonged. Nowhere. The notes came out differently. They were still not perfect, but they had feeling. Margaret played with the sadness of lost time and the hope of second chances. The music spoke about being invisible and wanting to be seen. "Much better," Professor Wright said. "Now you're playing music instead of just notes." Professor Wright began meeting with Margaret twice a week. He did not focus on technique like Professor Volkov. Instead, he helped Margaret understand the story that Chopin was telling. He explained how different sections of the piece represented different emotions. "This part is about anger," Professor Wright said, pointing to a section with strong chords. "Chopin was angry that life had taken him away from everything he loved. Have you ever felt angry about the choices you've made?" Margaret thought about the years when she had felt invisible in her own family. "Yes, I have." "Then play it with that anger," Professor Wright said. "Don't be polite. Be honest." Margaret played the section with more force than before. The music sounded powerful and real. She was not just playing Chopin's anger, she was playing her own. "This section is about hope," Professor Wright said, showing her a gentler part of the piece. "Even when Chopin was sad, he believed that things could get better. What gives you hope?" Margaret thought about Emma and David supporting her piano playing. She thought about the moments when the music sounded beautiful despite her mistakes. "I hope it's not too late to become who I was meant to be." "Play with that hope," Professor Wright said. Margaret played the gentle section and it sounded like morning sunlight. The notes were warm and full of possibility. She was no longer fighting the music. She was dancing with it. Professor Wright taught Margaret that her age and experience were advantages, not weaknesses. Young pianists could play faster and more accurately, but they had not lived long enough to understand what the music was really about. "Chopin was 21 when he wrote this piece," Professor Wright said, "but he was writing about the feelings of someone much older. Someone who had lost things and found them again. Someone like you. 2 weeks before the performance, Margaret could play the entire piece with real feeling. She still made technical mistakes, but the music had meaning. She was no longer afraid of the difficult passages because she understood what they represented. Professor Wright listened to Margaret play the complete piece and smiled. "You're ready for the performance." Not because you play perfectly, but because you play truthfully. Margaret felt nervous, but also excited. She had discovered something important about herself. She was not just learning to play piano. She was learning to express the parts of her life that had been silent for too long. The music had given her a voice that she had forgotten she possessed. The night of the performance arrived on a cold Thursday evening in November. Margaret woke up feeling calm, which surprised her. She had expected to be nervous, but instead she felt ready. She had practiced the Chopin piece hundreds of times and knew every note by heart. More importantly, she knew what the music meant to her. Margaret chose a simple black dress that made her feel confident. She did her hair carefully and put on the pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. James offered to drive her to the conservatory, but Margaret wanted to go alone. She needed time to think quietly before the performance. The conservatory looked different at night. The building was lit up with warm yellow lights and people were walking toward the entrance. Margaret saw families, students, and well-dressed adults who looked like they attended classical music concerts regularly. She took a deep breath and joined the crowd inside the building. Margaret found the backstage area where the performers were waiting. There were about 12 students performing that night. Most of them were young people in their teens and 20s. They looked confident and chatted easily with each other. Margaret felt like an outsider, but she was used to that feeling by now. A student with a violin case smiled at Margaret. "Are you performing tonight too?" she asked kindly. "Yes, I'm playing piano," Margaret replied. "The Chopin Ballade No. 1." The young woman looked impressed. "That's a difficult piece. I've heard other students struggle with it. You must be very advanced." Margaret almost laughed. "I'm probably the least advanced person here. I just started playing again 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks? The student said with amazement. "That's incredible. Most people need years to learn that piece." Margaret felt a flutter of pride. Maybe she had accomplished something special after all. She thanked the student and found a quiet corner to wait for her turn. The performance hall was filling up with people. Margaret peeked through the curtain and saw the audience. The hall had about 200 seats and most of them were full. She spotted her family in the middle section. Emma and David were dressed nicely and looked excited. James was checking his phone, but at least he had come. In the front row, Margaret saw Professor Volkov and Professor Mills. They were talking to other faculty members and looked serious. Margaret wondered if they were discussing her performance. She had a feeling they expected her to fail publicly. Professor Wright appeared backstage and walked over to Margaret. "How are you feeling?" he asked with his usual kind smile. "I'm nervous but ready," Margaret said honestly. "I keep thinking about what you taught me about playing the music truthfully." "That's exactly right," Professor Wright said. "Don't worry about playing perfectly. Just tell your story through Chopin's notes. The audience will understand." Margaret was the 8th performer on the program. She listened to the other students play and was amazed by their skill. They played complex pieces with confidence and precision. The audience applauded politely after each performance. When Margaret's name was called, she walked onto the stage feeling surprisingly calm. The concert hall looked larger from the stage, but she was not afraid. She had something important to say through the music, and she was ready to say it. Margaret sat at the beautiful black grand piano and adjusted the bench. She looked out at the audience and saw her family. Emma gave her an encouraging smile. David looked proud. Even James had put away his phone and was paying attention. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her grandmother's hands on the old piano in Poland. She thought about the dreams she had given up and the dreams she was finding again. She thought about being invisible for so many years and finally having a voice. Then Margaret began to play. The opening notes of the Chopin Ballade filled the hall. Margaret played with the confidence that comes from understanding rather than just technique. She was not trying to impress anyone with speed or accuracy. She was sharing her story through the music. The audience became very quiet. This was not the kind of playing they usually heard at student concerts. Margaret's performance had a depth and maturity that was unusual. She played with the wisdom of someone who had lived through disappointment and found hope again. As the piece progressed, Margaret forgot about the audience and the professors. She was lost in the music. The difficult passages that had given her so much trouble now flowed naturally. She played them with the understanding that they represented the hard parts of life that make the beautiful parts more meaningful. The middle section of the piece was gentle and hopeful. Margaret played it thinking about Emma and David supporting her music. She played it thinking about the morning practice sessions when she felt most like herself. She played it thinking about second chances and new beginnings. The final section built to a powerful climax. Margaret played with all the emotion she had kept hidden for 20 years. She played with the anger of being overlooked and the joy of being seen. She played with the sadness of lost time and the excitement of found purpose. When the last note faded away, the hall was completely silent. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the audience. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone started clapping. The applause grew louder and more people joined in. Soon, the entire audience was standing and clapping enthusiastically. Margaret stood up from the piano bench and looked out at the crowd. She saw Professor Wright clapping with tears in his eyes. She saw her family cheering proudly. She even saw Professor Volkov and Professor Mills applauding. Though they looked surprised, Margaret walked to the front of the stage and bowed gracefully. The applause continued for a long time. She had not just played the piece successfully. She had touched people's hearts with her music. After the concert, many people came up to Margaret to congratulate her. Other faculty members shook her hand and told her how moved they were by her performance. Students asked her about her interpretation of the piece. Margaret felt like she belonged in the conservatory for the first time. Professor Volkov approached Margaret backstage. "Mrs. Chun, I owe you an apology. I underestimated what you could accomplish." "Your performance was remarkable," Margaret smiled graciously. "Thank you, Professor. I learned that music is not about age or background. It's about having something to say." On the drive home, Margaret's family talked excitedly about the performance. Emma said it was the most beautiful piano playing she had ever heard. David said he was proud to have such a talented mother. James was quiet for a while, then said, "I didn't realize how much this meant to you." "You were incredible up there." Margaret smiled and looked out the window at the city lights. She had proven to herself that it was never too late to pursue a dream. She had found her voice through music and discovered that she had more strength than she ever imagined. The girl who had once sat next to her grandmother at an old piano had finally become the woman she was meant to be.